She's speaking to Mercantile Bank economist Trudi Makhaya on the issue. Gunther.
Thank you, Devin. Let's get straight on with it, shall we? Welcome, Trudi.
Thank you.
Smaller businesses, they're going to have a much tougher time than the big guys next year.
They are. I mean, you know, with the changes that we've had in the finance ministry and questions being raised about our fiscal stability, this cascades ultimately to the business owner because we've seen the currency being volatile. Eventually, there's going to have to be a response from the central bank. We've already seen interest rates go up before the currency was so weak. But with the currency being this weak now and inflation being the natural consequence down the line, we're likely to see more aggressive interest rate hikes going forward. So the business owner has to look at the total environment in terms of interest rates, exchange rates, but also weak demand. And this is weak demand locally and also internationally. And the idea would then be, how do you build resilience in such an atmosphere? So you first have to manage what you do have and preserve the customers that you have, ensure that you're not losing any. And if you are, you have a contingency plan about how you're going to meet your obligations towards employees. Your costs, input costs are also rising. So there's going to be very, very tight cash flow management that entrepreneurs have to engage in. Then, of course, there's the question of debt. A lot of entrepreneurs need debt to be able to produce what they're producing, but you might find that being able to service it becomes more difficult. And so it becomes a question of being proactive and approaching financial services providers to try and work out a plan for payment rather than waiting when there's a default and then the matter is out of your hands. So, you know, those are kinds of the proactive measures that can be taken. And of course, with the exchange rate, whether importing inputs for production or even exporting, one would need to hedge against currency risk and find simple products that would allow a person to lock in the exchange rate that they're facing in their business.
Yeah, but that in itself, locking in,
costs you money.
Costs you money, and it's extremely difficult for small people, small businesses to do that. Quite simply, they don't have the scope, do they?
They don't have the scope, they don't have the capabilities. And I think that's why, you know, Mercantile Bank being a bank for entrepreneurs, there's a huge focus on empowering the entrepreneur to understand, not to become a derivatives expert, but certainly to be able to manage with simple products, how they're going to navigate through this. I think it's also important to take into consideration that even where there are threats, there are some opportunities. So there are still cushions in the economy. There are still sectors that are doing well. So if there's a way to increase exposure to them or to even participate in them, like retail sector is still holding up. I don't want to overplay that because once demand starts taking a hit, retail will eventually take a hit. But for a while, that's been the sector that's been doing well. In the last GDP figures, we saw manufacturing also kind of starting to rear its head and increasing by over 6%. So the productive base of the economy is quite weak, but there's certainly scope for growth. The continent and our continental neighbors present an opportunity. I think we look to China, we look to BRICS. We also need to focus on the continent in terms of opportunities. Just across the border, we understand the continent. We've got historical ties, trying to deepen that. And I think a lot of smaller businesses often exclude themselves from the opportunity to trade across borders. And I think that's left to corporates.
Isn't that a problem of not knowing how to do this?
I think it's not knowing how to do it. So it's a question of familiarizing yourself with the countries that are best suited for your products, talking to agencies, be they government agencies, financial services providers who have thought about this and have packaged products and you know, government introduction services that take people to different markets to try and understand them. It does come up with an upfront cost of business development. But ultimately, I think when the local economy is so volatile, you do need to diversify the base through which you're earning your revenues. So export markets would be a very important area to look into.
I'm going to ask you to put your head on the block. We've got, 2016, we're probably going to see a lot more job losses.
Yes.
A lot of those people are going to have to find their own way. Do you anticipate a spike in entrepreneurship?
I do. So this is often where the problem comes. You find a spike in entrepreneurship where there are difficult times. But because a lot of those entrepreneurs are doing it out of necessity and not necessarily because they're seeing opportunities in the market, their businesses tend to be smaller, they tend to be more fragile. So I would caution for people who are going into entrepreneurship out of necessity to try to arm themselves as much as possible with research and knowledge to just up the chances of success. Because as we know, success rate for business in this country is quite low. There are many pitfalls, cash flow management being one of them, poor research, poor understanding of markets, and also sometimes poor delivery. So a business really has to gear themselves up to understand the environment, understand that it's also a long-term game. You know, some people think within 6 months of leaving employment, they can start relying on their business for income. That rarely happens. It's often a year or so before income starts coming into play. At the same time, you don't want to be too aggressive and do irresponsible things like cashing out your whole pension, because you also have to think about long-term preservation, which is why we always encourage people to be saving when they're in employment for these kinds of rainy days that are about to hit. But also, I suppose, to adjust lifestyles, even at the personal level. You know, we talked about business debt, but even personal debt levels, you know, one should try to reduce them as much as possible so that when, you know, the next thing is entrepreneurship, you don't want to be laden with, you know, store cards and all kinds of debt. I think the overall message is really about managing risk, trying to seek out information and partners that are able to ensure that you manage that risk and understand the volatility, so that in 2-3 years' time, when it all settles down, you've actually built a good base to soar when that happens. Because often the best business plans are tested in difficult times. And if they work in difficult times, of course, when the economy picks up, then you'll have more successful enterprises.
Well, Trudi, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
That's Trudi Makhaya. She's an economist at Mercantile Bank. With that, it's back studio.